So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rig every mailbox on this block with a paint bomb, kind used in banks. These things are very sensitive, precision, French made.
I have to tell you, the piece you wrote about your journey with the Joker was incredibly funny.
Good.
I expected nothing less. Like I said, we're going to publish it because it was too damn good not to use.
Let me know if you have notes to tweak it.
I have no notes. I have no notes. So look, I mean, you've had a long journey with the Joker. And it began, strangely enough, with Robin.
I used to watch the show as a kid, the Adam West show. I lived for a while in a subdivision in Farragut, Tennessee, and at the pool in the subdivision, they would announce 15 minutes till Batman, 15 minutes till Batman, and kids would clear out of the pool and go watch Batman, or a good chunk of them did. So it was reruns. So I liked the Cesar Romero. Him and the Penguin were my favorite on that show. And I had an uncle who would buy me comic books. So by the time I was in college, I had like one plastic bin of just Jokers that I took. My mother got rid of all my Star Wars stuff when I went to college. And I had about 70 record albums. They were mostly like punk and like a lot of Peter Gabriel, a lot of David Bowie, and she stored them in a cardboard box in a swamp, apparently, because they were completely destroyed. But the Jokers she actually kept. The Jokers she actually did not store in a swamp with my LPs. So I've had the collection probably since I was about 7 is when I very first started like keeping aside ones with the Joker, and I was like, that I'm going to keep.
Well, what was it about the Joker? I mean, you wrote about how when you were in your 20s, you had this sort of Joker experience. But when you're a kid, you know, it's interesting. Everybody gravitates toward Batman. Everybody gravitates towards Superman. For me, it was Green Lantern, Green Arrow. It was sort of all of that. I was a DC nerd. I was never a Marvel kid.
It's exactly the same.
But, you know, it's always the heroes. You want to be Batman. I used to draw the Batman insignia, his emblem all day long. That and the Enterprise. That's all I did on my junior high notebooks and elementary school notebooks. But, you know, I never gravitated toward the villains. It was interesting. My kid loved Two-Face. My son, when he was a little kid, loved Two-Face. But Joker, for some reason, never had the attraction. But I'm curious, why a villain?
If you look, I write comedy for a living, and I write like Two-Face. I have two sides. I have really family-friendly stuff that I write, like the Herbie Fully Loaded and
Not at the Museum.
You know, those that are super family-friendly. And then if you look at the other stuff, it's very dark. And it's not dark for dark's sake. It really does make me laugh a lot. Like we do Reno 911, and there's an episode where I accidentally, trying to save a cat, drop a cat into an air conditioning vent. It goes, whoosh, and it sprays up in my face. So we had like an air mortar filled with fake blood and cat fur beneath me, ready to go.
I remember it well.
I find that stuff hilarious, and I think like Dan Aykroyd on the old SNL used to do sketches where he would put his hand in the blender and he would drink.
Cut his hands off, the Julia Childs.
Yeah, and also my brothers probably showed me Monty Python when I was too young. And there's a lot of humor where people get their arms and legs cut off. And I was exposed to that at a very early age. And I thought the Joker, before I'd written any of that other dark stuff, something about tying people to a big giant birthday cake that was going to kill them, like really fascinated me. Like there was something about that I thought it was really funny, and it was also very suspenseful at the same time. They're like, I love that Batman and Robin were going to be killed by some giant confetti cannon. And there was something about it that I thought it was humorous, but it was genuinely suspenseful. And I just liked the way the Joker looked. There was something about him that was so weird. Clowns are scary anyway. I love as a kid, I love that there was this clown that everybody was scared of. I thought that was really fascinating. And I love, like, when I became a writer, I love the evolution of the Joker over his 100 years is incredible. That he was just a villain. It was just like in those first ones, he was just a gangster, and he was going to kill somebody unless you gave him the money. And they didn't even really explain why he looked like that, which was fascinating. And then you show he dipped in acid in Detective Comics 168, and that made him like that. And then Killing Joke added to that he was not even wanting to be a criminal, and it drove him insane. Like, there was that great 70s Detective Comics, like 253, the Joker Amok with the big playing card.
Right. The Neil Adams cover.
The Neil Adams cover. And that was the first time he was crazy. Like, before that, he was just kind of a bad guy who liked to scare people, and the clown makeup scared people. But that's the first one where he started actually, like, he would derail in mid-conversation and start making jokes and kill his henchmen. And then he evolved into, in the 90s, bona fide bananas. And he was so bananas in the 90s that Batman started to be more bananas, too. Then it started to make the Batman, it dealt more into his, like, Arkham Asylum, cutting himself to stop thinking about his mom. So he got so crazy in the 90s that it made Batman go crazy in the writing too. And I love that there are very few characters, just to get to be nerdy writer guy, there are very few characters who over 100 years, dozens of great writers have added to his story and changed it and tweaked it and added a little bit here and let's do the Heath Ledger version. There are very few characters like that like comic book characters that a bunch of different artists and writers get to add to the legend. And I love that. And I think the Joker's, Batman is always Batman. He's changed a little. Superman is always Superman. He's changed a little. Like, the Joker has really changed with the times.
So it's interesting, right? Because when Joker was initially introduced, he was terrifying because he's killing people. You don't know why he's gassing them. They have that horrific shriek, that grin that he has. I mean, they die looking like him. And then certainly during the 50s, that golden age period, it becomes sort of a wacky Joker, big hammers, the big sort of dopey stuff. And then 70s when Batman starts to get a little more grim, all the way through Frank Miller, Dark Knight, where Joker ends up basically twisting his own neck to make it look like Batman murdered him. Meanwhile, Batman thinks, oh, I actually might have done it. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary arc. So, but what you're talking about,
as a kid,
the more you talk about it, the more I sort of I do understand that, because I've certainly, but it's interesting. I always read it from the perspective of Batman, never from the perspective of Joker.
I think he's a great villain. I think in the Heath Ledger movie, his story ran circles around Batman. Like, he was just so much more fascinating in that movie than Batman is. I'm waiting for them to. They tried it with that Robert Pattinson one. I'm waiting for them to make a movie where Batman is as interesting as the Joker was in that Heath Ledger one, or in the Joaquin Phoenix one. Like, I'm waiting for them to make that Batman, which I don't think they have yet. I don't think they've made a Batman that is as interesting as those two Joker movies.
That's an interesting point. It's funny. Maybe the Michael Keaton Batman, maybe.
That was more about him, and but it was so weird that they hadn't made a Batman movie, a serious Batman movie ever, and then Tim Burton made that one in the late 80s, and it was the Joker's origin story. Batman was already up and running, and they decided to. I mean, that movie, if you count the airtime, like, the Joker's in that way more than Batman. Which is, I think he's an interesting character. As a kid, I love the way he looked, and then as an adult, I did a fair amount of acid in New York when I was a young, struggling wannabe sketch writer, and as I was doing acid, that's when all those incredibly weird, like the Frank Miller and Arkham Asylum, that's when they really started to explore how weird Joker was, and also explore what a comic book could look like. Arkham Asylum doesn't look like anything before it. And Killing Joke looks like an old 50s comic times a million. It just looks like they took an old 50s comic book, but it's like that Brian Ball, and every page is just like this beautiful laid out work of art, and it's just such a great story, and it really, like, I feel really lucky to have been the right age to appreciate it, like when comic books got really serious in the 90s, when like people realized, oh, these aren't just for kids. Let's realize that there's a lot of adults reading comic books, and let's make some that the maybe kids aren't allowed to see. And I think that was a real golden age.
But see, that's an interesting thing, because Dark Knight, Killing Joke, Arkham Asylum, all that redefined comic books. You start adding Watchmen and other stuff into there as well, but then you realize that redefined comic books so much that Alan Moore eventually complained that comic books stopped being for kids. So those comics that we loved when we were young, I'm just a couple years older than you, those don't exist anymore. They're very grim. Batman Gargoyle, the stuff that's coming out now is very grim, very dark, and very much influenced by what we loved about what comics had become in the 90s.
I think that's why Marvel is eating their lunch in Hollywood. I think that Marvel realized these should be for kids too. Right. And I think that and again, it kills me because I'm a DC guy from the moment I could read, and the DC movies are terrible. I think and the Marvel ones are great. They're fun. They're popcorn. Like they're stuffing them for adults, but they're mostly for kids. Like I think the people that complain about Marvel movies, I ask, do you have kids? And they say no. And I say, well, this is about a guy in a cape running around punching another guy in a cape. These are for kids, and so I think, but I like that they're entertaining for adults as well. But Marvel remembers that, like, if you got dipped in a vat of something and now you're robbing banks, you're in a kid's movie, or you should be, you know what I mean? Like, so and DC has just totally forgotten that. DC made these movies that I can't. There isn't a single Wonder Woman movie I can show my daughter. That's crazy. That's absolutely insane. There isn't a single Batman movie I can show my son except for the Adam West ones. That's insane that they don't remember that DC totally forgot these are for kids too, Right. I love that they wrote all those comics for me in the 90s, but they need to do both, and it's a shame.
So was there a point when you were a kid, you say 7 years old, you started getting these comic books? Was there a point at which you realized you were only collecting Joker, or was that a conscious decision from the very get-go?
When I left home, I really realized that I was taking this collection seriously when I was about 17, and I moved out of Tennessee to go to New York for college. And I had a lot of stuff in my room that I needed to either throw away, donate, or tell them to hang on to. And the only things that I really told my parents to hang on to were the Jokers. And so I really looked through. I read a lot of The Flash. I was a big Green Lantern fan just because it looked so cool. I loved just his legend and how just different those comic books looked. Some great covers. But the only ones that I took aside and said, okay, I think I'm going to hold on to these, were just the Jokers. And I had a box about that big of just Joker comics. So I think that's when I realized this is serious. And then I went to college and was in the state comedy group. So I didn't really have time I had no money. I barely had money for food. So I didn't collect anything for, 10 years. And then when I started to settle in again, that's when I got my stuff back from Tennessee and realized, oh, wow, this is impressive. And then I started to really take seriously collecting those comics. And it was also, those were some of the best covers on the stands, like in the 90s. It was just like the Joker, Brian Boland was doing it, like Bernie Wrightson was doing some really interesting stuff. And there was some really just great Joker stuff. It wasn't until my 30s that I realized, I'm going to take this collection very seriously now. I collected, when I was little, Smurfs. They used to sell Smurfs at record stores for $0.25. You could get it. There was like a bin next to the cash register, and you get the Smurfs. This was before the Smurf TV show. And so I collected them, and I had like 150, and I used to write down which ones I had and describe what they were. And relatives would give me, they would know I was into Smurfs, so they would give me Smurfs. And and my parents said I was such a dick. I would be like 6 years old, and I would say like, no, I don't need that one. Because I already like, what a dick. Like, and so I, for some reason, I'm a very big collector. Like, I just have that in my DNA. And then I decided in my 30s, like, I'm going to really take this seriously. And then when the internet happened, I realized, oh, you can really find them all now. Like it went from going through boxes at Comic-Con and like, oh, here's one, you know, and it would take a day and you would find two. And Comic-Con used to only be comic books. It was like a bunch of like weird guys and going through boxes of comic books. And then the internet happened and you could really find them all. And that was really a good, fun way to search. I spent a lot of COVID, like after the kids were asleep, going through and like searching and finding. But with the internet, you could really do a search and you could get big giant photos of other people's collection. So you could zoom in and be like, oh, I've never seen that one before. Oh, I've never seen that one before. Because there's no database of all of the Jokers. You know, you have to really be.
There's gotta be.
It doesn't have them. Like, it doesn't have them all. Because it doesn't have, like, the weird Prell in the 60s came out with, like, 20, like, where you would buy Prell and it came with comic books. And, like, you know, Fruit of the Loom had one that was really hard to find. It came with a pair of Fruit of the Loom in the 80s. It doesn't have all those. And it doesn't have all of the, like, weird, you know, Hitman comics and all the strange, you know, this time he went up against the Injustice League. You know, there's no database of every single weird comic book. And then I have a brother who lives in Finland, and he started sending me European ones. And those are sometimes have totally different covers, and some of their covers are magnificent. Some of their covers are completely different than ours and just gorgeous. And so then I started to look for foreign ones and to see what I could find. But yeah, as a writer, my hobby was writing something else. You know, like you would write for hire, you know, right. So I'd be working on a movie. And then in my spare time, I would write something, you know, a spec. I would write something for me. So I never really had a hobby. And the closest thing I've really had to a hobby my whole life is collecting Joker covers. That's kind of it. A little bit of gardening, but that's my life has been writing and collecting Jokers is what I do in my tiny bit of spare time.
Did you ever write a Joker script?
I wrote, there's very few opportunities to get in at DC. I wrote a bunch that they didn't use. They were trying to do these shorts for kids right. for the WB that were like really funny. They wanted like Plastic Man, like really funny Plastic Man. And I wrote a ton with the Joker and the show went away. They ended up not doing it. It was going to be like a Looney Tunes, all funny, but all with DC superheroes and villains. It was really fun. And they never did the show.
Well, I love the Brave and the Bold, the cartoon.
It's great. I love the tone. I love that it's kid friendly. I love the look. Yeah. No, I was in development for an Aquaman movie with totally different producers, Adam Rich, other guys. And then it went away. And then like 10 years later, they did the big giant like Aquaman movie. But I was in development for 8 years on an Aquaman movie. I loved it. It was so good. And then they decided they're not going to make an Aquaman movie. And then 10 years later they did, and they made $1 billion.
And it was terrible.
It was terrible. It had no like sense of humor. Like DC, it's like they have a meeting and they say like, no humor, guys. That's Marvel's thing. And that's crazy. That's crazy that they don't have humor in their movies, especially Aquaman. When I was in a comedy group, The State, right out of college, and
very familiar.
We did a show on MTV, and we did a Super Friends sketch where we were full on Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Robin, The Flash, and Aquaman, and MTV was like, okay, like I can't imagine that happening now. Like it was their iconic characters. MTV just put it on the air we didn't change anything. We said, and now, meanwhile, with the Hall of Justice, and we went in. And after it aired, we got a phone call from DC Comics. And I thought, oh, right. we should have asked permission or something. And instead they gave us a tour of their offices. This was in like 1995. So they had offices at 666 Fifth Avenue, these beautiful offices, and one floor, it had 2 lobbies, and one floor's theme was Gotham City, and then the next floor's theme was Metropolis. And it was just breathtakingly nerdy and so cool. And they weren't mad. They gave us a tour, and they gave me a big stack of like the Flash comics. It was great.
Well, I always thought that State sketch was an homage to the SNL sketch, which also had all that stuff as well.
Yeah, that had the Hulk and yeah, Bill Murray was Superman and everything.
Right.
Yeah, super, very, very nerdy. That was from our live show. We used to do, before we're on MTV, we would play like black box theaters in New York, and we did that sketch live. And so like normally it was like us, no set, a couple of chairs, black box theater, wearing our grungy like Sex Pistols t-shirts and stuff, lights down, lights up, and we're all in just complete like cartoon outfits, and our crowd was usually very stoned, and it went over very well. The Super Friends sketch like was always went over great.
So I know you wrote about the fact that you made a vow that when you turned 50 that it was time to part with this, that you sort of gave yourself a cutoff, because it is the great sort of conundrum of every collector. How long do I hold this stuff? How much do I burden my family with this down the road? I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that you just sort of said 50, that's it.
I thought I was going to stop collecting at 65. And this was in my like 30s. I thought 65, I'll retire, I'll sell them, and then I'll just be done. And then as I got older, and also like when I had kids, I thought like that's a little selfish. Like, because I'll get rid of it, and we'll have a little bit of money come in, and my kids will both be out of the house by then. And so it's like my wife and I are going to take a world cruise without the kids. It was just like that seemed a little like far off. And so I want my family and my kids to be able to enjoy the proceeds of it, especially since for their entire lives I've said, don't touch that. Wait, don't, you can't touch that one. Here, you can read this one. You can't read these, because they're in my house. I've got like a safe that had them all, like the really valuable ones were in a safe, but then the rest of them were on shelves and in drawers and in closets, and it was a ticking time bomb before my kids like got into it, and like that's Detective Comics 168, and then I become the worst father ever because I'm yelling at my kid for reading a comic book. Right. So I decided I cut 15 years off of it and said like, okay, 50, I'm gonna get at 50, I'm gonna get rid of them. And I stopped collecting them I stopped buying new ones when the Joker turned 80. Because DC, that was like 5 years ago, like DC started doing these crazy variant where every single comic had like 20 different variant covers.
Correct.
They were very difficult to find. Some of them somebody would buy them all and then sell them on eBay for a ton. And I knew none of these are ever going to be worth a dime. Like if you kept these 1,000 years, this is DC just trying to make money off of these variants. It was such a bummer. And also the covers were really ugly. Like they started doing these like heavy metal Joker covers, and it looked like really bad Black Sabbath album covers. And they did a year of just that. And like the Joker with his face like peeled off and then like glued onto the back of his head.
Correct.
I was just like, guys, like they were really like Joker, especially those early ones. There's eras of incredible Joker covers that are just so beautiful. They look like Lichtensteins. Like Batman number 11, it looks it looks like they've been doing the Joker for 100 years. Like, and it's his third cover, and it's just perfect. They're like punching him back, and there's like a splay of cards. It's beautiful, and that was their third ever Joker cover. And so I stopped at his 80th birthday. And now I'm ready to get rid of them. It's a little scary. I'm a little frightened that I'm getting rid of them. It's weird. Just because I'm like trying to fight off starting to collect something else because I shouldn't. And I have all these like empty shelves and drawers in my house, and like my instinct is like, oh well, let's look at something else to start collecting, and I shouldn't, but I'm having withdrawal is what I'm doing. I'm having Joker withdrawal. And I have big holes on the walls too, where Joker art used to be, and looking at them makes me anxious.
Well, I mean, you kept some books. There's certainly plenty of trade paperbacks. I'm certain you kept.
Yeah, I kept Greatest Joker Stories Ever Told, because that's just got a good like batch of them, and then I kept the Arkham Asylum and Death in the Family and Dark Knight Returns and some random ones, because I always had reading copies of anyone that was really good. I would buy two and then pack one and keep the other one for reading. So I still have a little shelf of them, but I don't have like this weird hoarder office full of Jokers everywhere. Which is,
were they all slabbed? I mean, did you buy them slabbed? Did you care that they were slabbed, or you bought them raw? You just like, did you want to read them?
If it came off of the shelf, I would usually look at it at the comic book store, and if it was really good, or if it was an artist or writer I would buy two, and then put one immediately into safekeeping. And yeah, I mean, a lot of them were really easy to find, and some of them I just took whatever I could get. Some of them you would order them, and they would come wrapped in newspaper from Slovakia and had mustard stains on them. You never really knew, but I would just try to. Yeah, it was always a weird search, and I tried to never. I specified it was easy to not buy comic books because I only bought them with the Joker on the cover. So in a way, it was very like focused, and I didn't waste a lot of time buying other comic books.
Don't you feel like you might have missed out on some good comic books by just focusing on the Joker?
Yes, yeah, for decades. Yes, I think that's
right. You didn't read Grant Morrison's JLA. I mean, you didn't read any of that.
I did. No, I did. I did that. I still have all of these are comic books that are not Joker. They're still here. So no, but I'm sure I missed out on a lot of very, very good stuff. Yeah.
I going back for a second, and I'll wrap this up here in a second because I think we've been going about half an hour, and it's a long time to talk about the Joker.
I'm all yours. Whatever you want.
But I'm fascinated by the two sides. You talked about Two-Face at the beginning of this, about the two sides of your work, the family stuff and the darker comedic stuff. I would have thought that Two-Face would have been a guy, but then again, when you talk about the more you talk about Joker, your affection for the Joker, I'm sort of, and how much you love Batman 11, for instance. I'm fascinated by sort of that wacky Joker period. Like he was the scariest, non-scariest villain, like for the longest time. I mean, you knew he wasn't going to kill anybody in that certain, there's that certain 15, 20-year period where it was just, hijinks, basically. And then it became that Batmite era, all that stuff.
And there was also just on Saturday morning cartoons, there like the Joker would appear. There was like this great period of the Super Friends where every like 30th episode the Flash would be on, and you're like, oh wow, the Flash, and then sometimes Green Lantern would be on, but like only like twice. Right. And it was really, really cool. And in that era, like the Joker would sometimes appear on Super Friends, and sometimes he would appear on Scooby-Doo. Like sometimes he would, like the Scooby-Doo gang would be after the Joker, which was like, wait, he murders everybody. Like it was such a weird, like it was from a weird scarecrow who's scaring people out of the carnival to like the Joker murders people, guys. Like, and it was such a weird thing. And it was that weird Joker who kind of talked like this weird Edward G. Robinson guy. It was like this really weird voice and everything. But
did Ted Knight do? No,
Ted Knight did the Joker, and it's really bizarre. It's a really weird thing. So he would always appear, and then you would read these comic books, and they were his props, even as like not as a little kid, but like in my early snarky teenage years, like you would read Joker comics and be like, this is so expensive. This thing that he built to rob a bank. Like why would he build like a totem pole that launches into the air? That's a lot. That's very expensive. Like why wouldn't it was like, but it was such a great, weird, like sight gags. Like none of the other, there were no other villains. Like Two-Face would sometimes have something kind of big and over the top, but like they would really structure those comic books around these huge sight gags, a big giant birthday cake. And it was a really fun combination. I think it warped me just because it was these crimes that he was doing, but it looked like you were reading like a Mickey Mouse comic, you know, big giant fun pie in the face.
Right, big red hammers, the guns that
red
could bang.
hammers. Yeah, it really looked like, you know, pre-Ren and Stimpy, pre any of that weird stuff. It was like super, super violent, but super aimed at little kids. I don't know. Probably not great for little kids, but I loved it.
But I mean, that was sort of the joy of it, I think, for a lot of us who loved comics at that particular period. Because when I think about, I remember when that first issue of Joker came out, when DC, he was the first villain to get his own comic book. And I thought, all right, I get that. I get why it's Joker and not Lex Luthor, for instance. Lex was just a bald, angry, pissed off, you know, businessman who did not like Superman very much. Joker had gags, he had gimmicks, he had shtick.
It was like a real flavor. Like it really took over. Like when he was in a comic book, it felt like a Joker comic. It didn't feel like a Batman is just playing catch up, but like the visuals are just these weird circus. You're always going to some like abandoned carnival. You're just like, how many abandoned amusement parks can Gotham have? You know, like, but it really visually just totally changed. There was no other villain that would just take over the look and feel of a comic book the way that the Joker always did. You know, the other ones, it felt like the superheroes were there visiting the villain, but Joker felt like you were visiting him, like you were in his world and you had to sneak around and figure out all of his booby traps. It was just really, it's like the old Muppet Show, like the really good guest stars of the Muppet Show felt like they took over the show, like John Cleese and like Linda Jackson. Like suddenly you're on their show, and that's, the Joker just took over. It was just because he was crazy. He wasn't playing by any kind of rules at all. And
well, there was no other villain that's more symbiotic, had more of a symbiotic relationship with his hero than Joker and Batman. They were very much sort of the same. There were two sides of the same coin. I mean, it is, which is an odd metaphor to use given the fact that Two-Face actually used a coin. But
yeah.
the fact that when you think about, you know, Batman in a comic book not long ago is tethered to the Joker by having to carry his head around, the head that won't stop talking to him. In Dark Knight, you don't know if Batman's actually snapped the Joker's neck or if Joker did it and Batman's imagining. There's certainly that fan theory that Batman imagines that whole monologue in his head. There was no villain that was more tethered to his hero than those guys.
It's really evolved into that. I think that's really interesting to me, that over like the Joker's going to be 100 soon, and like it's really evolved. I love that it's a combination of like what the audience is responding to. Oh, people really like the Joker, and then it's like very few villains. They keep changing him and adding and making him a little bit deeper and deeper and deeper. And they change his motivation and they sort of change his personality, but they never throw the old one out the window. It's just like this kind of yes and, you know, what if he really did go crazy when he went in the acid? You know, what if he doesn't care about money at all? What if for him now, he's just as obsessed with Batman as Batman is against him? And I love that he's evolved. James Bond is exactly the same. You know, they have this different guy, and now they can't be as sexist as they used to be. But like the character is pretty much unchanged. And Batman, the character hasn't changed that much, but the Joker has become more and more fleshed out over his evolution. And I think that's fascinating. And I up until about 20 years ago, I loved every turn that he took. And then I think he took a turn about like 10, 15 years ago that it kind of lost me. Like yeah. He started just being like, oh, this is just a sociopath. And this is kind of losing the charm. You know, I think the Joker peaked at Mark Hamill. I think I think he was the best performance of the Joker. I thought that show was the best iteration, my favorite iteration of Batman. I thought it looked like the old comic book without feeling old-timey. And I thought that the Joker in that was perfect. Like, I thought he was violent but funny. Like, he would go back and forth between like shtick, but then he would actually do some damage and hurt somebody. Like, I thought that was a great realization of like the first 70 years of a character. Yeah, I thought Mark Hamill's Joker was the peak. I thought that was just, everybody was had totally figured out the Joker, and then Mark Hamill stepped into his shoes and was perfect.
So you were out by the time of the Batman Who Laughs of a few years ago.
Yeah, I was out by then. Yeah, that's when I started reading them and thought, yeah, that's kind of when I bailed. And then those like Metal Knights, I was just like, ugh,
right.
Yeah.
That's that same period. That whole the Earth Negative Zero or whatever it was.
Yeah, I was. Yeah, it felt. Do you remember when like the Blackest Night, the things that the Green Lantern went through all that,
Right.
like 20 years ago, when it was just like so dark and interesting, and it felt a little like the Joker stuff just felt like, okay, I guess there's a lot of people who are super into this, but I'm going to step off this train right now because this is not my thing. Like,
do you find that? I mean, it's interesting, right? You talked a little bit about in your essay that you wrote about how you had done the One Bad Day monologue. At one point, you had memorized it. Did you feel like the writing of, or the definition of the Joker, at least how you interpreted him? Because certainly you can interpret a character that may be different from the writer. As a writer yourself, you know that people take ownership of a thing after you've created it. You can no longer control how people interpret it. But did you find that your interpretation of and absorbing sort of those different versions of the Joker over the years impacted your own writing?
Nothing that ever sold, like like to be honest, like because like Arkham Asylum was such a great. Arkham Asylum was such an incredible evolution of a comic book because you were looking at it and it didn't look like a comic book, and it captured this idea that you were sort of in the head of different individuals as you went through the comic book, which you can't do that in any other form. You can't really, in a movie, like you can't pull off just like every page was a very different visual style based on, are we in Croc's world? Are we in Arkham's world? Are we in Batman's head? And it was such a great evolution of that. And I've tried to do that. Like I've tried to do that with animated films where you really, especially horror, where you're walking through a space and you don't know, is this real or is this beautiful mind and we're in the head of one of the characters? And that's all really kind of stolen from those 90s Frank Miller and those Dave McKean, those great animation. I do for sure think that a lot of my violent punchline sense of humor, because Monty Python is very violent, but they don't have violent punchlines usually. Like you'll chop off somebody's leg, but then like that's not the punchline. You keep going, and the funniness is the guy's attitude. But like when you look at Reno, there's a lot of Junior into the wall is a punchline, or off the bridge is a punchline, or shot in the face is a punchline. And I think violent punchline is the Joker's.
Well, see, that's what I'm getting at. That's exactly what I was getting at.
Yeah, I think that's the Joker. I think that idea of, there's a Reno where I like walk up to a car and the exhaust is blowing smoke, and then when the smoke blows away, the car is gone, and like that's a Joker gag. There's a lot of like me, because I didn't want to. It's very hard. I wanted to do my own stunts, which is a mistake. Don't do your own stunts. But I end up as Junior doing a lot of things where I, at the end of my go-kart catches on fire at the end, or I end up going into a puddle and drowning at the end. And a lot of that is that Joker structure of this is a big joke and it's going to end when this bomb blows off. And I think that's a lot of, I think that's just too many Joker comics as a kid.
Well, that's you answer the question in as much as that. I always kind of figured that once I put together that you were a Joker collector in the last few weeks, and when I went back and started watching some old Renos, I thought, wait, there is a symmetry here that I don't think I would have known otherwise.
There's I think other than the Cops on Reno 911 and the Joker, not a lot of people do jokes where the joke is like that the gun might go off and they're not paying attention. That's one of our bits, and that's his big bit. Is just like if he's talking to somebody and you don't know, like, is he going to kill a henchman? Is he going to kill Batman? And like that's that's me and Dangle do that all day. You know, that's like we, yeah, because we're always steal from the greats, kids. Don't do your old stunts, and always steal from the greats. And we're stealing from the Joker.
Well, man, I appreciate you doing this. I'm very excited to go walk through your collection. It must be incredibly strange to know that it's now sitting somewhere else and that it will soon be scattered to the wind. But just think about the fact that it wouldn't have been put together at all had it not been for a 7-year-old you falling in love with those comic books. So well done.
I hope that there are people who collect, and I hope that they, because I've over the years I've run into and bidded against people who also have Joker collections, and I hope that my joy is that I'm positive they're going to look through and be like, never saw that one before. You know, like it's going to have so many weird, obscure, you know, ones that came with NASCAR magazine. You know, like there's gonna be like, and I love that people are going to be thrilled with like weird little, you know, parts of their collection that they didn't know existed. I know I was always thrilled when I saw something that had the Joker on it that I'd never seen before. That was always a great, like, you know, that was always just a great bolt of like, oh, wow, look at that. Wonder Woman against the Joker. When did that happen? You know, and I love that people are going to be able to look through and see strange, weird 40-year-old Jokers that they've never knew existed. That to me is very fun.
Well, it's funny, if 7-year-old me had started collecting a specific character, I'm not sure it would have been Joker. It probably would have been Power Girl, but
I have those too. I have those as well. Yeah.
But I appreciate the fact that you took this particular avenue. I think it's a fascinating. I'm always fascinated by collectors who collect that very specific thing. I mean, it's not just comic book. It's not just baseball cards. It's Joker. It's obscure. It's foreign. There's a Hostess comic book. I think a Ding Dong with a Joker. You probably bought all of that stuff as well.
I think, I honestly, I wish I had a better explanation for why, but originally I just liked the way he looked, and I liked the way the books looked. I just loved the weird combination of whimsical and crime. It was just there's nothing like it, and just some of the covers over the years are just so much fun. And I love that. It's like an element of fun that's not in Two-Face or the Riddler, you know, or Catwoman. Catwoman's got her thing going and it's great, but like there's an element of whimsy to them. But there's always behind the whimsy darkness, and I just think it's great.
You can't ask for a better explanation than that. I really appreciate it.
I really appreciate your time.